I'm Jennifer Wilkins, 32, a military intelligence analyst who built order out of a chaotic childhood. For years, I paid my parents' bills, fixed their emergencies, and kept their crises off my back. Then they sent a wedding gift. My major glanced at the account number, went pale, and said, "Report this, now." Agents walked in minutes later. I chose my oath over blood, and everything changed. Been undervalued or blindsided by someone you carried? Share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into it, tell me where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. I grew up thinking my parents were just bad with money. That's what I told myself when I was 12 and found my mother crying over bills at the kitchen table, or when my father would disappear for hours after another phone call from a creditor. They weren't criminals, I reasoned. They were just irresponsible. My childhood was punctuated by financial emergencies that somehow always resolved themselves. The electricity would get cut off, then mysteriously reconnected. The car would get repossessed, then reappear in our driveway a week later. I learned not to ask questions about these minor miracles. I learned that stability was something other families had. What my parents did have was charm. My mother could talk her way into or out of almost anything, her voice taking on this lilting quality that made people want to help her. My father had this easy laugh that filled rooms, making everyone forget that he'd shown up empty-handed to every gathering. They were the kind of people others described as characters lovable, exasperating, impossible to stay mad at for long. By high school, I'd become the family problem solver. When my parents couldn't figure out how to refinance the mortgage, I spent my weekend at the library researching loan modifications. When they got behind on taxes, I called the IRS myself, sitting on hold for hours until I could arrange a payment plan. I told myself this was normal. All families had their challenges. The military chose me as much as I chose it. During my senior year, a recruiter visited our school and spoke about discipline, honor, service. The words hit me like physical things. Here was a world where people showed up on time, kept their promises, solved problems instead of creating them. Here was everything my family wasn't. My parents' reaction to my enlistment was predictably dramatic. My mother accused me of abandoning them. My father called it a phase. Neither seemed to grasp that I needed structure the way other people need air. The military gave me something I'd never had, the confidence that came from being competent, reliable, essential. Boot camp was easier for me than for most recruits. I was already accustomed to chaos, already skilled at finding solutions under pressure. While others struggled with the rigid schedules and high expectations, I felt like I'd finally found my natural habitat. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who valued preparation over improvisation, accountability over excuses. The distance helped our relationship initially. My parents seemed proud of my uniform in photos, bragged to neighbors about their daughter the soldier. But they still called when things got difficult, and I still sent money when they needed it. Old habits, even dysfunctional ones, die hard. I discovered I was good at military intelligence work. The attention to detail, the methodical thinking, the need for absolute precision, it all came naturally. My superiors noticed. Promotions followed. With each advancement, I felt the gap between my world and my parents' world widening. Still, I kept sending checks. When my father's business failed, I covered 3 months of their mortgage. When my mother needed dental work she couldn't afford, I paid the bill directly to avoid questions about where the money had gone. When they faced foreclosure, I liquidated my savings account and wired them enough to get current on their payments. I told myself this was love. This was what responsible children did for struggling parents. I ignored the way they never quite said thank you, the way my financial help seemed to enable rather than solve their problems. I ignored the growing resentment I felt when friends talked about parents who had helped them buy cars or pay for college, parents who gave rather than took. The pattern was always the same. Crisis, panic, desperate phone calls, then my money making everything temporarily fine. They'd promised to be more careful, to budget better, to finally get their act together. These promises would last about 6 weeks before the cycle started again. Meeting David changed things. He was everything my parents weren't: steady, reliable, someone who kept his word. He worked in military logistics, understood the value of planning and preparation. When I introduced him to my parents, I watched him try to hide his confusion at their casual relationship with truth, their assumption that someone else would always clean up their messes. David never directly criticized my parents, but he asked questions that made me uncomfortable. Why was I always the one solving their problems? When had they last helped me with anything? What would happen if I stopped being their safety net? These weren't accusations, just gentle observations that forced me to examine patterns I'd spent years avoiding. Our engagement was a turning point I didn't see coming. For the first time in my adult life, I had something that was mine alone, something my parents couldn't reach or complicate. David and I planned a small ceremony, nothing elaborate, just family and close friends. We could afford it ourselves, wanted to keep it simple and meaningful. But as the date approached, I found myself hoping my parents would surprise me. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe they'd step up, offer to help, show some investment in my happiness that wasn't tied to what I could do for them. Maybe they'd prove that our relationship was more than a series of financial transactions. The wedding planning revealed familiar patterns in new ways. Every conversation somehow became about them, their needs, their image, their comfort. They worried about what other guests would think, complained about the expense of travel, made subtle suggestions that revealed their real concern, how they would be perceived, not how I would be celebrated. I brushed off these concerns, determined to believe that family meant showing up for each other during important moments. I wanted to trust that when it mattered most, they would choose me over their own complications. That trust would prove to be the most expensive mistake of my military career. But in those final weeks before the wedding, surrounded by all the small preparations that make a marriage real, I still believed that love would be enough to bridge the gap between the person I'd become and the family that had shaped me. Looking back, I think they believed it too. The complaints started 3 weeks before the wedding. My mother called to say that the hotel was too expensive, even though I'd already offered to pay for their room. My father left voicemails about having to take time off work, as if attending his daughter's wedding was an inconvenience rather than a celebration. Every conversation included subtle digs about David, questions about whether I was sure this was what I wanted, suggestions that maybe we were rushing things. Their RSVP came 2 days before the deadline, after I'd called twice to ask about their plans. Even then, they seemed to treat their attendance as a favor they were doing me rather than something they actually wanted to be part of. When I mentioned this to David, he just squeezed my hand and said, "They'll show up. That's what matters." But their behavior suggested otherwise. They complained about everything. The ceremony location was too small, the reception would be too casual, why hadn't we hired a photographer they'd heard of, why weren't there more elaborate flowers? Each criticism felt like a small rejection, as if nothing I'd planned was quite good enough for their standards. The money conversation happened during what I thought would be a routine planning call. My mother brought it up casually, almost as an afterthought. "Of course, we want to give you something for the wedding," she said. "A proper gift, something significant." I should have been suspicious. My parents had never given me anything significant without strings attached. But I wanted to believe that this time was different, that they'd finally found a way to support me that didn't require me to support them first. I thanked them and said whatever they could manage would be wonderful, that their presence mattered more than any gift. Their language should have been a warning. They talked about the gift as if it were a business transaction, something that would reflect well on the family, that would show other guests they weren't the deadbeats some people probably thought they were. They seemed more concerned with appearances than with actually helping David and me start our married life. The week before the wedding brought more troubling signs. They called to discuss logistics, but spent most of the time talking about themselves, what they would wear, where they would sit, who they might see that they hadn't talked to in years. My wedding had become their social opportunity, their chance to present a polished version of themselves to people who remembered their various failures and embarrassments. They arrived the day before the ceremony, and I could feel their anxiety immediately. They were trying too hard, speaking a little too loudly, laughing a little too much at things that weren't particularly funny. My mother kept adjusting her outfit, asking if it looked expensive enough. My father made jokes that weren't quite jokes about how much weddings cost these days, how young people didn't understand the value of money. During the rehearsal dinner, they dominated conversations with stories about my childhood that painted them as more involved parents than they'd actually been. They talked about sacrifices they'd made for my education, support they'd provided for my military career, conveniently forgetting the years when I'd been the one providing support. David squeezed my hand under the table, a silent reminder that we'd get through this together. The ceremony itself went smoothly, but I could see my parents performing throughout it. They weren't experiencing my wedding, they were managing their public image during my wedding. Every smile was calculated, every gesture designed to convey the message that they were proud, involved, successful parents rather than the people who'd spent decades relying on their daughter's stability to mask their own chaos. At the reception, they held court at their table, telling anyone who would listen about my accomplishments as if they'd been instrumental in creating them. They took credit for my discipline, my success, my choice of career, conveniently ignoring their repeated attempts to talk me out of military service when it meant I'd be less available to solve their problems. But despite everything, I felt hopeful. They'd shown up. They'd behaved reasonably well. Maybe this could be a turning point, the beginning of a healthier relationship where they saw me as an adult worthy of respect rather than just a resource to be tapped when needed. 3 days after David and I returned from our honeymoon, the transfer appeared in my account. $25,000, labeled wedding gift from Mom and Dad. It was more money than they'd ever given me for anything, more than I'd thought they had access to. My first reaction was gratitude, followed immediately by suspicion. My parents never did anything without an angle, and they'd never had that kind of money sitting around. But I pushed down my doubts, determined to accept this gesture at face value. Maybe they'd finally managed their finances well enough to save for something important. Maybe this was their way of showing they valued my happiness enough to make a real sacrifice. I mentioned the gift casually to Major Peterson during our Monday morning briefing, more as a personal update than anything requiring official attention. He was reviewing my security clearance renewal paperwork, and I thought it was worth noting that I'd received a significant monetary gift, just to be transparent about any changes in my financial situation. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. Major Peterson stopped mid-sentence, looked at the account information I'd provided, and went completely still. His face changed in a way I'd never seen before, not angry but afraid. "Where exactly did this come from?" he asked, his voice carrying a weight that made my stomach drop. When I explained about the wedding gift, he stood up so quickly that his chair rolled backward. "Report this immediately," he said, already reaching for his secure phone. "Don't touch that money. Don't contact your parents. Don't do anything until we figure out what we're dealing with." The next hour passed in a blur of federal agents, emergency briefings, and forms that required me to detail every interaction I'd had with my parents over the past 2 years. The money they'd sent me, their generous wedding gift, had come from an account flagged by federal investigators as connected to money laundering operations they'd been tracking for months. My parents hadn't given me a gift. They'd made me an unwitting accomplice. The investigation room felt smaller every minute. Special Agent Martinez sat across from me, her expression neutral but alert, while Agent Clark took notes in a leather portfolio that looked like it had seen a dozen similar conversations. Major Peterson stood near the window, his jaw tight with the kind of anger that comes from watching someone you've trusted get manipulated by people who should have protected them. They explained it carefully, professionally. The account that had sent me the wedding gift was part of a network being investigated for financial crimes, specifically laundering money through small, legitimate-looking transactions that would fly under normal regulatory radar. $25,000 was exactly the right amount, significant enough to clean a decent sum, small enough to avoid automatic federal reporting requirements. "Your parents would have known this," Agent Martinez said, her voice gentle but clear. "The account structure, the amount, the timing, this wasn't accidental. Someone taught them how to do this." I felt something cold settle in my chest. All those years of mysterious financial recoveries, all those times my parents had somehow found money when they desperately needed it, all those crises that resolved themselves without explanation. The pattern made sense now in a way that made me sick. We need you to understand, Agent Clark added, that receiving this money puts your security clearance at serious risk. Even if you had no knowledge of its source, even if you reported it immediately, there will be consequences. Major Peterson finally spoke. The good news is that you did report it immediately. Your reaction when I saw that account number, your cooperation right now, that's going to matter. But Jennifer, you need to cut all financial ties with your parents today. Not tomorrow, not after you talk to them. Today. They walked me through the next steps. The money would be frozen pending investigation. My parents' other accounts were already being examined. My own finances would be scrutinized to determine if I'd received other suspicious transfers over the years. The security clearance review process would be expedited, meaning weeks of interviews and background checks to determine if I could continue in my current role. What happens to them? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. That depends on what we find, Agent Martinez replied. And it depends on their level of cooperation. I thought about my parents sitting at home, probably congratulating themselves on their generosity, probably already planning how they'd leverage this gift into future requests for help. Did they understand what they'd done to me? Did they care? The agents gave me their cards, explained the contact protocols, reminded me about the restrictions on discussing the investigation with anyone except David and my assigned counsel. As they prepared to leave, Major Peterson pulled me aside. I've seen this before, he said quietly. Family members who think they can use military connections for cover, who assume their relatives' security clearance makes them untouchable. They never think about what happens to the person they're using. That word, using, hit me like a physical blow. Because that's exactly what my parents had done. They'd used my wedding, my happiness, my trust as cover for whatever arrangement they'd made with people I couldn't even imagine. They'd put my entire career at risk to solve some financial problem I didn't even know they had. David was waiting when I got home, having received a carefully worded call from Major Peterson explaining that I'd be late and upset. I told him everything, watched his face change as the implications became clear. He didn't say, "I told you so," didn't point out that he'd been suspicious of my parents' sudden generosity. He just held me while I cried for the relationship I'd thought I had with my parents, and the career I might lose because of their selfishness. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, writing down every financial transaction I could remember between my parents and me over the past 5 years. Every emergency loan, every crisis payment, every time I'd sent money without asking questions. The list was longer than I'd expected, the amounts more significant than I'd acknowledged. Tomorrow, I would have to call them. I would have to explain that their gift had blown up in both our faces, that federal agents were now very interested in their financial activities, that my career hung in the balance because of their decision to involve me in something I'd never consented to be part of. But tonight, I just sat with the reality that the people who were supposed to love me most had risked everything I'd worked for to solve problems they'd never bothered to tell me about. The phone call with my parents was worse than I'd anticipated. My mother answered on the second ring, her voice bright with the artificial cheer she used when she wanted something or was hiding something. "Jennifer, how are you enjoying married life? David treating you well?" "Mom, we need to talk about the money you sent me." The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. When she finally spoke, her tone had shifted to the careful neutrality she used during financial crises. "What about it, honey? We wanted to do something nice for your wedding." It came from a flagged account. Federal agents spent 3 hours questioning me yesterday. My security clearance is under review. Another silence, longer this time. Then my father's voice in the background, muffled but urgent. "What is she saying? What's wrong?" My mother came back on the line. "I'm sure there's been some mistake. We'll look into it and get back to you." "There's no mistake," I said. "The money is frozen. My career is in jeopardy. And you're going to be hearing from investigators very soon." What came next was predictable but still painful. First, denial. They had no idea what I was talking about. The money was completely legitimate. Someone must have made an error. Then minimization. It wasn't a big deal. These things happened all the time. I was overreacting because of my military training making me paranoid. Finally, when neither of those approaches worked, came the guilt. How could I accuse them of wrongdoing? After everything they'd sacrificed for me? After they'd scraped together money they couldn't afford to give me a proper wedding gift? How could I be so ungrateful, so suspicious of their motives? Because your motives have always been suspicious, I said, the words coming out harder than I'd intended. Because every time you've helped me, it's ended up costing me more than it cost you. And because this time, your help might cost me everything I've worked for. My father took the phone then, his voice carrying that edge of anger he'd always used when confronted with consequences for his actions. "We're your parents," he said. "We're not some criminals you need to investigate. Then explain where that money came from." He couldn't, of course. Or wouldn't. The conversation devolved into accusations and hurt feelings, with my parents positioning themselves as the injured parties, misunderstood and unappreciated despite their good intentions. They hung up after I told them that all financial contact between us was ending immediately, that they needed to find legal representation, and that I wouldn't be available to help them navigate whatever came next. David found me sitting on our couch afterward, staring at my phone. "How bad was it?" he asked. "They still don't understand what they've done," I said. "They think this is something that's happening to them, not something they caused." The next few days brought a parade of family phone calls. My aunt called to ask what was going on, why my parents seemed so upset, whether there was some kind of misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a conversation. My brother called to accuse me of being dramatic, of making trouble where none existed, of forgetting that family comes first. Each conversation followed the same script. I was overreacting. My parents were good people who'd made an innocent mistake. Military life had made me rigid and suspicious. Couldn't I just forgive and forget, smooth things over, find a way to make this go away? The answer was no. Because even if I wanted to protect them, I couldn't. The investigation was already in motion. Federal agents don't abandon money laundering cases because the daughter of two suspects asks nicely. My parents' world was about to get much smaller and much more complicated, and for once, I wouldn't be there to catch them when they fell. Major Peterson called daily with updates. The investigation was expanding. Other accounts had been identified. My parents weren't the masterminds, but they weren't innocent victims either. They'd been recruited specifically because their daughter's military service made them seem unlikely to attract scrutiny. "They used you twice," he explained during one particularly difficult briefing. "First as cover for their activities, then as an unknowing participant in money laundering. Your wedding was just convenient timing." I asked him what would happen to them. He said it depended on their level of cooperation, their willingness to provide information about the people who'd recruited them, their ability to demonstrate remorse and accountability. Based on my description of our phone conversation, he wasn't optimistic about any of those factors. That's when I made the decision that would define the next chapter of my life. I wouldn't just cooperate with the investigation. I would actively support it. Every financial record they needed, every conversation I could remember, every detail that might help them understand the scope of what my parents had been involved in. It wasn't revenge. It was survival. My parents had put my career and my freedom at risk to solve problems they'd created and hidden from me. Now I would put their problems ahead of their comfort to protect the life I'd built despite their influence. The transformation happened gradually, then all at once. First, my parents' social circle began to notice something was wrong. Phone calls weren't returned. Invitations stopped coming. The small community where they'd spent years maintaining appearances started to whisper about federal investigations and frozen accounts. My mother called me twice during this period, both times in tears. The first time, she begged me to fix the situation, to use my military connections to make the investigation go away. When I explained that I had no such power and wouldn't use it if I did, she accused me of choosing strangers over family. The second call came after their bank accounts were frozen, and they couldn't make their mortgage payment. She wanted me to loan them money to tide them over until this misunderstanding was resolved. When I reminded her that all financial contact between us had ended, she called me heartless and hung up. My father's approach was different, but equally predictable. He called my commanding officer directly, trying to convince him that I was having some kind of breakdown, that family stress was affecting my judgment, that my accusations against them were symptoms of mental instability brought on by the pressures of military life and new marriage. Major Peterson's response was swift and decisive. My father was told that any further contact with my chain of command would be considered witness intimidation and would result in additional charges. The call also backfired spectacularly, demonstrating exactly the kind of manipulative behavior that supported the prosecution's case against them. Meanwhile, my professional life stabilized in ways I hadn't expected. My immediate cooperation with the investigation, my willingness to provide information even when it was painful, my clear prioritization of institutional integrity over family loyalty. All of these factors worked in my favor during the security clearance review. "You handled this exactly right," Agent Martinez told me during one of our final interviews. "Your parents put you in an impossible situation, but your response showed judgment and character. That matters to us." The clearance was renewed without restriction. My commander commended my handling of a difficult family situation. Colleagues who might have been suspicious or judgmental instead seemed to respect my choice to do the right thing even when it cost me personally. David and I settled into our new normal gradually. Without the constant drama of my parents' crises, without the financial drain of their emergencies, without the emotional exhaustion of managing their problems, I discovered what marriage could be like when both people were focused on building something together rather than cleaning up messes from the past. But the hardest part wasn't the professional consequences or even the family drama. It was accepting that the relationship I'd thought I had with my parents had never actually existed. They didn't love me the way I'd convinced myself they did. They loved what I could do for them, the problems I could solve, the stability I could provide. When I stopped being useful, they stopped pretending to care about my well-being. The investigation concluded 8 months after my wedding. My parents were charged with conspiracy to commit money laundering, failure to report structured transactions, and tax evasion. The people who'd recruited them, a network of small business owners who'd been washing money for organized crime operations, received longer sentences, but my parents' participation earned them 18 months each in federal prison. They never admitted guilt, even as part of their plea agreement. Right up until sentencing, they maintained that they'd been innocent victims of a scheme they didn't understand, people who'd been trying to help their daughter and gotten caught up in something beyond their control. The judge wasn't impressed. During sentencing, she noted that both defendants had adult children in positions of public trust, that they'd specifically used their daughter's military service to appear more credible to their criminal associates, and that their lack of remorse suggested they viewed themselves as victims rather than participants. I didn't attend the sentencing hearing. By then, I'd realized that watching my parents face consequences for their choices wouldn't give me closure or satisfaction. What I needed was distance, time to build a life that wasn't defined by their drama or my reactions to it. The extended family gradually stopped calling. Without my parents to coordinate family gatherings, to create crises that required everyone's attention, to generate the kind of chaos that had always defined our interactions, the family simply dispersed. My brother moved across the country and rarely called. My aunt sent Christmas cards, but stopped asking about my parents or expecting me to provide updates on their situation. David and I bought a house, started talking about children, planned vacations that didn't include emergency trips home to solve other people's problems. For the first time in my adult life, my money stayed in my account from paycheck to paycheck. My time off was actually time off, not crisis management sessions disguised as family visits. The freedom was overwhelming at first. I'd spent so many years responding to my parents' emergencies that I didn't know how to function without constant low-level anxiety about what might go wrong next. David helped me learn how to relax, how to make plans without assuming they'd be interrupted by family drama, how to trust that our life together could be stable and predictable in the best possible way. My parents were released after serving 14 months each. They moved to a smaller town, found jobs that matched their reduced circumstances, and began the slow process of rebuilding their lives without the benefit of my financial support or social connections. They made a few attempts to reconnect, always framing their outreach as though nothing significant had happened between us. A birthday card with a generic message. A phone call asking how I was doing, as if we'd simply fallen out of touch rather than experienced a criminal investigation that had nearly destroyed my career. I responded politely but minimally. Yes, I was doing well. Yes, David and I were happy. No, we didn't need anything. No, I wouldn't be visiting anytime soon. The conversations were brief, surface level, empty of the emotional manipulation that had characterized our relationship for so many years. Some people expected me to feel guilty about this distance, to eventually forgive and resume our relationship as if nothing had happened. But I'd learned something important during those months of investigation and testimony. Forgiveness doesn't require forgetting, and love doesn't require self-destruction. My parents had made their choices. They'd chosen to involve me in criminal activity without my knowledge or consent. They'd chosen to risk my career and my freedom to solve problems they'd never bothered to tell me about. They'd chosen to manipulate my wedding, one of the most important days of my life, as cover for money laundering. Now I was making my choice. I chose the life David and I were building together. I chose my career, my integrity, my peace of mind. I chose to define family as people who supported each other rather than people who shared DNA and a history of dysfunction. The last time I spoke to my mother, she asked when David and I might have children, whether we'd want her help when the time came. The question revealed how little she understood about what had changed between us. She still thought this was temporary, that eventually I'd need her again, and we'd return to our old patterns. "I'll let you know," I said, already knowing I wouldn't. 5 years later, David and I have 2 children, successful careers, and a circle of friends who understand that family is something you choose as much as something you're born into. My parents have never met their grandchildren, and probably never will. This isn't a decision I made in anger or spite. It's a decision I made in clarity and self-preservation. Sometimes people ask if I miss them, if I regret how things ended between us. The question assumes that there was something good that ended, rather than recognizing that what ended was my willingness to pretend that a destructive relationship was healthy just because it involved people who shared my blood. I don't miss the constant anxiety about their next crisis. I don't miss the guilt that came with every financial decision I made for myself, knowing they might need money I wasn't giving them. I don't miss the exhaustion of managing their problems while trying to build my own life. What I do miss is the fantasy I'd maintained for so many years, the idea that they loved me unconditionally, that they were proud of my achievements, that they wanted what was best for me even when they couldn't provide it. But that fantasy was never real, and letting go of it allowed me to build relationships based on actual love and mutual respect rather than obligation and manipulation. My children will grow up in a different kind of family. They'll learn that love is something you demonstrate through actions, not just claim through words. They'll understand that relationships require reciprocity, that trust must be earned and maintained, that boundaries aren't selfish but necessary for healthy connections. They'll never know their paternal grandparents' story, at least not until they're old enough to understand complex moral situations. But they'll know that their parents chose each other, chose them, chose to build something stable and honest and supportive. The wedding gift that nearly destroyed my career ultimately gave me something more valuable than money: clarity about what I wanted my life to look like and the strength to create it, even when it meant disappointing people who'd spent years taking my loyalty for granted. Justice, it turned out, wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about finally understanding that I deserved relationships that supported rather than undermined me, and having the courage to accept nothing less. The account number that changed everything was just a string of digits on a bank transfer. But sometimes the smallest details reveal the largest truths about the people we think we know and the choices that define who we really are. The years that followed taught me that healing isn't linear, that building a life free from toxic patterns requires constant vigilance against old habits. Even with my parents out of my daily existence, I found myself falling into familiar behaviors, checking my bank account obsessively, expecting crises that never came, feeling guilty when good things happened without accompanying drama. David noticed these patterns before I did. He'd find me staring at my phone after particularly peaceful weekends, as if waiting for the emergency call that would shatter our calm. "You know they can't reach you anymore," he'd remind me gently. "You changed your number. You moved. You're safe." Safety was a concept I had to learn from scratch. For so many years, I'd lived in a state of low-level alert, always prepared for my parents' next catastrophe. Without that constant threat, I didn't know how to exist. Peace felt suspicious, like the calm before a storm I couldn't see coming. Therapy helped, though I resisted it initially. Major Peterson suggested it during one of our routine check-ins, noting that my hypervigilance was affecting my work performance despite my clearance being secure. "You've been in survival mode for decades," he said. "Learning to live instead of just survive takes practice." Dr. Chen specialized in family trauma within military contexts. She understood the unique pressure of maintaining security clearances while dealing with relatives who seemed determined to create chaos. Our early sessions focused on untangling my sense of responsibility for my parents' choices from my actual obligations as their daughter. "You keep using the word abandoned," she observed during our fourth session. "But abandonment implies leaving someone who is caring for you. What you've described sounds more like refusing to enable people who are using you." The distinction mattered more than I'd expected. I'd spent months feeling guilty about abandoning my parents when they needed me most, but Dr. Chen helped me recognize that they'd never actually needed me. They'd needed my money, my problem-solving skills, my willingness to clean up their messes. They'd never needed me as a person worthy of love and respect. Meanwhile, David and I began building traditions that had nothing to do with crisis management. Sunday morning coffee without phones. Weekend trips planned weeks in advance and actually taken. Holiday celebrations that happened on schedule because no one had created an emergency that required immediate attention. These small consistencies felt revolutionary after a lifetime of chaos. I started to understand what people meant when they talked about boring being beautiful, about peace being a gift rather than the absence of interesting events. My career flourished in ways I hadn't anticipated. Without the constant distraction of family emergencies, I could focus entirely on my work. My analyses became sharper, my recommendations more strategic. I volunteered for challenging assignments, knowing that my personal life was stable enough to handle professional demands. 3 years after the investigation, I was promoted to Senior Intelligence Analyst, a position that required extensive background checks and interviews with colleagues and supervisors. Every person they spoke to emphasized my reliability, my judgment under pressure, my ability to prioritize institutional interests over personal considerations. The situation with your parents actually demonstrated exactly the qualities we value most, my new supervisor explained during the promotion interview. When faced with a conflict between family loyalty and professional integrity, you chose integrity. That's not common, and it's not easy. The promotion came with increased responsibility and security access that would have been impossible if I'd chosen to protect my parents instead of cooperating with investigators. Their criminal behavior had nearly destroyed my career, but my response to their behavior had ultimately advanced it. This irony wasn't lost on me. By refusing to enable their dysfunction, I'd gained opportunities that their previous manipulation had always threatened to take away. The career they'd nearly destroyed through their selfishness was now thriving because I'd had the strength to cut them loose when they endangered it. David and I started talking seriously about children during this period. For the first time in my adult life, I could imagine bringing kids into a stable environment, one where their needs would come first instead of being secondary to someone else's emergencies. We bought a house in a good school district, started saving for college funds, planned the kind of future that required long-term thinking. But pregnancy brought unexpected anxieties. As my body changed and our future became more concrete, I found myself worrying about what kind of mother I would be, whether I'd absorbed more of my parents' dysfunction than I'd realized, whether I was capable of providing the consistent love and support I'd never received. Dr. Chen helped me work through these fears methodically. We talked about the difference between inherited trauma and chosen behavior, about how recognizing dysfunctional patterns was the first step in refusing to repeat them. She helped me understand that my hypervigilance about being a good parent was actually evidence that I would be one. Your parents never worried about whether they were damaging you, she pointed out. The fact that you're concerned about your impact on your children suggests you'll make very different choices than they did. When Emma was born, healthy and perfect and entirely dependent on us, I felt something shift inside me that I hadn't expected. The fierce protectiveness that consumed me as I held her for the first time wasn't just about keeping her safe from external threats. It was about ensuring she never experienced the anxiety and instability that had defined my childhood. I would never put her in the position of managing my problems. I would never use her love as leverage to get what I needed. I would never make her responsible for my happiness or stability. She would grow up knowing that her job was to be a child, not a caretaker or problem solver or emotional support system for adults who should know better. David watched me make these silent promises to our daughter, probably recognizing the intensity in my expression. "She's going to have a completely different childhood than you did," he said quietly. "You're going to make sure of that." My parents learned about Emma's birth through my aunt, who'd heard it from my brother, who'd heard it from David's mother during a chance encounter at a grocery store. The news made its way back to me through the same convoluted family network that had once been used to coordinate my assistance during their various crises. My mother called 3 days after Emma was born, using a number I didn't recognize. I'd changed my phone number twice since cutting contact, but somehow she'd obtained the new one. Her voice was careful, artificially bright, as if she were calling to chat with a friend she hadn't spoken to in a while rather than the daughter she'd endangered with criminal activity. "I heard you had a baby," she said, as if this were casual news rather than information she'd had to work to obtain. "A little girl. Emma, right? That's such a pretty name." I stood in my kitchen, Emma sleeping in my arms, and felt the familiar tightness in my chest that my mother's voice always triggered. "Yes," I said simply. "I'd love to meet her," my mother continued, her tone becoming more pleading. "I mean, I am her grandmother. I know things have been complicated between us, but this is different. This is about her, not about the past." But it wasn't different, and it wasn't about Emma at all. It was about my mother wanting access to something good in my life, wanting to be part of a happy story after years of creating unhappy ones. It was about her inability to accept that actions have permanent consequences, that some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. "That's not going to happen," I said, keeping my voice steady and calm. "Emma won't be having a relationship with you or Dad." The silence that followed was familiar, the pause my mother always took when she realized that charm and manipulation weren't going to work, when she had to decide whether to escalate to anger or try a different approach. She chose guilt. "She's your daughter, Jennifer, but she's also my granddaughter. You can't just erase us from her life. That's not fair to her. What if she wants to know us when she's older? What if she resents you for keeping us away?" These were questions I'd already considered extensively during pregnancy, discussions I'd had with David and Dr. Chin about how to handle extended family relationships, and future conversations with Emma about my parents' absence from her life. "If Emma wants to know you when she's an adult, that will be her choice," I said. "But while she's a child, it's my job to protect her from people who might hurt her. And you've proven that you're willing to hurt people you claim to love when it serves your interests." My mother's voice cracked slightly. "We never meant to hurt you. The money thing, that was a mistake, a misunderstanding. We thought we were helping." "You thought you were using my wedding to launder money for criminals," I corrected. "You thought my military service would provide good cover for your illegal activities. You thought I'd protect you if things went wrong, just like I always had before." Another silence, longer this time. When she spoke again, the artificial brightness was gone, replaced by the edge of anger I remembered from childhood arguments. "You've become so cold, Jennifer. The military changed you. You used to understand family loyalty. I used to enable your dysfunction," I said. "I used to mistake enabling for love, just like you mistake using people for caring about them. But I won't raise my daughter to make those same mistakes." I hung up before she could respond, then immediately blocked the number she'd called from. David found me sitting at the kitchen table afterward, Emma still sleeping peacefully in my arms, my hands shaking slightly from adrenaline. "How did it feel?" he asked, sitting down across from us. "Terrible," I admitted. "And right?" Both at the same time. That conversation marked the end of my parents' attempts to reconnect through direct contact. But it didn't end their efforts to maintain some presence in my life. They began using social media, creating fake accounts to view photos I posted, sending friend requests to David's relatives, commenting on posts from friends we had in common. The digital stalking was subtle but persistent, like emotional white noise that I could ignore most of the time but never completely forget. They wanted me to know they were watching, that they hadn't given up on finding a way back into my life. It was a passive form of the manipulation they'd always used, applying just enough pressure to create anxiety without crossing lines that would justify extreme responses. David suggested we move across the country when Emma turned 2, when a promotion opportunity arose that would take us to the West Coast. The official reason was career advancement, but we both knew the real motivation was distance. 3,000 miles between us and my parents felt like enough space to breathe freely for the first time in years. The move was liberating in ways I hadn't anticipated. In our new city, no one knew my story or my family history. I could introduce myself without the mental calculation of what to reveal about my background, without the underlying tension of wondering if my parents might appear unexpectedly. Emma could grow up without the shadow of relatives who might complicate her sense of security. We found a neighborhood full of young families, people building lives and traditions from scratch rather than managing inherited dysfunction. Emma made friends whose grandparents sent birthday cards and holiday gifts, who came to school plays and soccer games, who provided the kind of consistent love and support that I'd never experienced but was determined to create for my daughter. When Emma started asking about my parents, why Daddy had a mom and dad who visited but Mommy didn't, I told her age-appropriate versions of the truth. Some families were different. Some grandparents weren't safe for children to be around. Mommy and Daddy had chosen to build our family with people who were kind and trustworthy, and that was what mattered most. She accepted this explanation with the adaptability of childhood, more interested in the people who were present in her life than curious about those who were absent. David's parents filled the grandparent role beautifully, providing the consistency and unconditional love that I'd always wanted my parents to offer, but that they'd never been capable of giving. By the time our son James was born 2 years later, I'd mostly stopped thinking about my parents except during therapy sessions or late-night conversations with David about family dynamics and inherited trauma. They'd become characters in my past rather than threats to my present, people who'd shaped me but no longer controlled me. The investigation that had nearly destroyed my career was now just a footnote in our family story, something that had happened before the children were born, something that had led to better decisions about who we allowed into our lives. The crisis that had felt world-ending at the time had actually been the beginning of our real life together, the event that forced me to choose between dysfunction and health. My parents aged into irrelevance gradually. Christmas cards with no return addresses. Birthday cards for children they'd never met. Occasional emails from extended family members mentioning that they seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the consequences of their choices and the loss of their primary enabler. I felt neither satisfaction nor regret about their reduced circumstances. They'd made their choices just as I'd made mine. The difference was that my choices had led to stability, growth, and genuine happiness, while theirs had led to isolation and decline. Dr. Chen helped me understand that this lack of emotional investment in their outcomes was actually a sign of healthy boundaries rather than callousness. You can wish them well without sacrificing your own well-being, she explained. Indifference isn't cruelty when it comes to people who've consistently harmed you. When Emma turned 7, she brought home a school assignment about family trees that forced more detailed conversations about my parents' absence. She was old enough now to understand more complex explanations, mature enough to grasp that some adults make choices that hurt other people, even people they're supposed to love. Did they ever say sorry? She asked after I'd explained that her missing grandparents had made bad choices that could have hurt our family badly. No, I told her honestly. They never did. Sometimes people can't admit when they've done something wrong, even when admitting it might help them fix it. She considered this seriously, the way children do when they're trying to understand adult complexities. That's really sad, she said finally. For them, I mean. Because they don't get to know us, and we're pretty great. Her matter-of-fact assessment of their loss struck me as perfect. My parents had traded a relationship with their daughter and grandchildren for whatever temporary financial benefit they'd gained from their criminal activities. They'd chosen money laundering over family dinners, criminal associates over birthday parties, their own immediate needs over long-term relationships with people who could have brought joy and meaning to their lives. The sadness wasn't mine to carry anymore. It was theirs, and they'd earned it through decades of poor choices and manipulative behavior. My job was to ensure that their dysfunction didn't infect the healthy family David and I were building, that their absence became a gift rather than a wound. When James started kindergarten, I volunteered for school activities and community organizations, building the kind of social connections that had been impossible when I was constantly managing my parents' crises. I had time and energy for friendships, for hobbies, for the small pleasures that make daily life rich and meaningful. Other parents sometimes asked about extended family, about grandparents and holiday traditions, conversations that had once been minefields of explanation and awkwardness. Now I simply said that David's parents were wonderful and very involved, and that my own parents weren't part of our lives. Most people understood that some families were complicated and didn't push for details. The few who did push, who seemed to think that all family relationships could be repaired with enough effort and forgiveness, learned quickly that I wasn't interested in their opinions about choices they didn't understand. I developed a polite but firm way of ending these conversations that protected both my boundaries and my children's understanding of our family decisions. Every family has to decide what works best for them, I'd say with finality. This is what works best for us. 10 years after cutting contact with my parents, I received notification that my father had died of a heart attack. The information came through my brother, who'd maintained sporadic contact with them and had been listed as their emergency contact since I was no longer available for that role. The call was brief and factual. Dad had collapsed at work, been taken to the hospital, died before my mother could get there. The funeral would be small, mostly attended by neighbors and a few remaining friends. My mother was handling arrangements, but was struggling with both grief and the practical details of being alone. My brother's tone suggested he expected me to feel guilty, to recognize this as a moment that required setting aside past grievances for the sake of family loyalty. When I responded with condolences, but no indication that I'd be attending the funeral or resuming contact with my mother, his disapproval was obvious. "He was still your father," he said, "the way people do when they think biological relationships supersede all other considerations." Yes, I agreed. And I'm still the daughter he chose to involve in money laundering without my knowledge or consent. Death doesn't erase the choices people made in life. I felt sad about my father's death, but it was the abstract sadness of hearing about any human loss rather than the specific grief of losing someone important to me. He'd stopped being important to me years ago when I'd finally accepted that his love had always been conditional on my usefulness, that our relationship had been transactional rather than genuinely caring. David offered to attend the funeral with me if I changed my mind, but I knew that going would send the wrong message to my mother, would suggest that death had somehow reset our relationship or that enough time had passed to forgive what couldn't be forgiven. It would also confuse my children, who'd grown up understanding that their missing grandparents weren't part of our family for good reasons. Instead, I spent the day of my father's funeral at the beach with David and the kids, building sandcastles and collecting shells, creating happy memories instead of processing complicated grief. It felt like the right choice, the healthy choice, the choice that honored the life I'd built rather than the one I'd escaped. My mother made one more attempt at contact 6 months later, sending a letter through my brother that described her loneliness and financial struggles since my father's death. She suggested that his passing might be an opportunity for us to start fresh, to move beyond past misunderstandings and rebuild our relationship. The letter revealed how completely she still misunderstood what had happened between us. She characterized their criminal activity as a misunderstanding rather than a deliberate choice that had endangered my career and freedom. She framed my response as an overreaction rather than appropriate self-protection. She positioned herself as the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of consequences. Most tellingly, she made no apology, took no responsibility, showed no recognition that she'd done anything requiring forgiveness. Instead, She asked me to forgive her for my reaction to her behavior, as if the problem had been my inability to accept being used rather than her decision to use me. I didn't respond to the letter, but I kept it as a reminder of why I'd made the choices I'd made, why maintaining boundaries was necessary for my family's well-being. Sometimes the strongest evidence that you've made the right decision is the other person's continued demonstration that they haven't learned anything from the consequences of their actions. Emma found me reading the letter one evening, probably recognizing something serious in my expression. She was 12 now, old enough to understand more complex family dynamics, mature enough to handle honest conversations about difficult topics. "Is that from them?" she asked, not needing to specify who them meant. From her, I clarified. "Your grandfather died last year, and your grandmother wrote to ask if we might want to have a relationship now." Emma considered this seriously. "Do you want to?" "No," I said without hesitation. "The reasons we don't have a relationship with her haven't changed. If anything, this letter shows that she still doesn't understand why I had to protect our family from her choices." "Good," Emma said with the straightforward moral clarity of adolescence. "Our family is better without people who don't know how to be safe." Her simple assessment captured something I'd spent years learning to articulate in therapy and countless conversations with David. Our family was better without people who created chaos, who used love as manipulation, who prioritized their immediate needs over long-term relationships, who couldn't be trusted to make choices that considered other people's well-being. We were better without them, and that was reason enough to keep them excluded from our lives. As my children grew older and our life became more stable and predictable, I sometimes reflected on the alternative timeline where I'd chosen differently, where I'd protected my parents instead of cooperating with investigators, where I'd prioritized family loyalty over institutional integrity. In that timeline, I'd probably have lost my security clearance and my career. David and I might not have had the financial stability to buy our house or plan for our children's futures. We'd still be managing my parents' crises, still explaining their behavior to friends and colleagues, still living in the constant anxiety of wondering what they might do next to complicate our lives. My children would have grown up with grandparents who taught them that love meant accepting behavior that hurt you, that family loyalty required sacrificing your own well-being for other people's mistakes, that boundaries were selfish rather than necessary for healthy relationships. That timeline might have seemed more traditionally family-oriented to outside observers, but it would have been built on dysfunction disguised as devotion, enabling disguised as love. My children deserved better than that, and so did I. The choice I'd made, to prioritize the family I was building over the family I'd been born into, had required courage I didn't know I possessed and strength I'd had to develop through practice. But it had led to the kind of life I'd always wanted. Stable, honest, built on mutual respect rather than obligation or manipulation. Sometimes healing looks like dramatic confrontations and emotional breakthroughs. Sometimes it looks like quiet consistency, like choosing healthier patterns day after day until they become natural. Sometimes it looks like walking away from people who claim to love you but consistently demonstrate otherwise. The wedding gift that had nearly destroyed my career had ultimately given me permission to choose the life I wanted rather than accepting the one I'd inherited. The crisis had forced clarity about what kind of relationships were worth maintaining and what kind of family I wanted to create. My parents had taught me exactly what not to do, exactly what kind of parent and partner and person I didn't want to become. In their way, they'd been excellent teachers, providing clear examples of choices that led to isolation and consequences that couldn't be avoided forever. The account number that started everything was just digits on a screen, but it represented the moment when I stopped accepting dysfunction as normal and started demanding better for myself and the people I loved. It was the moment when I learned that you can't save people who don't want to be saved, but you can absolutely save yourself from people who are determined to drag you down with them. That knowledge, hard-won and painful to accept, had become the foundation of everything good in my life. That's how a wedding gift almost ended my career. I had to choose duty over family, and it changed everything. Have you ever been put at risk by someone you trusted the most? Do you think blood should excuse betrayal, or are there lines family should never cross? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear your story. And if you believe in setting boundaries and protecting your peace, Hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about choosing yourself.